And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this strong front weakening, but moving well into the interior, at least pushing snow well into the interior tonight, with blizzard warnings this evening for Bristol Bay and overnight tonight for the Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence Island, in toward the Seward Peninsula, with winter weather advisories out for snow and blowing snow, pushing into the northwest coastal areas as well as Kotzebue Sound with some light snow into the Kobuk Valley. Clear and cold central eastern interior tonight with light wind conditions. Rain or showers, southern panhandle, fair to the north. For tomorrow, this front really weakens here as it crosses the Alaska Range with just some isolated precipitation in the Matanuska-Sitna Valley down into Cook Inlet, maybe the Kenai Peninsula, but amounts will be light. Heavier precipitation back along the front here, back to the northwest, ending over the southwest interior. Another system develops, brings increase in the wind and rain for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, the Pribilofs. And a few isolated lingering showers will linger over the southern southeast coast. And for Thursday, now that system tracks east-northeastward here, just south of the Kenai Peninsula, so snow into south central Alaska, rain and snow Kodiak Island up to the North Gulf Coast, and snow back over the southwest interior, Kuskokwim Valley up into the mid-Yukon River Valley and in toward Norton Sound, and snow showers following in behind for Bristol Bay, and some scattered showers over the Aleutians and southern Bering Sea, and just a few isolated showers over the Panhandle. Otherwise, maybe a few sun breaks with light wind conditions, and dry also up over the northern and eastern interior with some light snow for the Arctic coast. And for the coastal water forecast, northwest winds 20 knots there in the south coast, northwest 15 on the central coast, and north to northeast at about 10 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, north winds 15 knots. Otherwise for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, pretty light winds at 10 knots from a north or northwesterly direction. And for the outlook on Thursday, southeast winds 10 knots, central northern inner channels for Clarence Strait specifically, northwest at 10 knots, and west-northwest at 10 to 15 knots for the south coast. Central coast through here looking at south to southeast winds at 15, and then east winds 15 to 20 knots for the north coast. And for Cook Inlet, tomorrow, northern Cook Inlet, light variable winds. South of the Foreland Zone, south at about 15 knots. Light and variable winds for Kamishak Bay. Southwest winds 15 knots for the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, and variable to south winds at 10 to 15 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound looking good, southeast at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. And for Thursday, Prince William Sound, northeast at 20 knots, seas 4 feet. And east winds at 30 knots now for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north at 25 here on the west side. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, west winds 35 knots, west winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay, 20 knots for southern Cook Inlet, and light variable winds for northern Cook Inlet. Bristol Bay for tomorrow, southwest winds at 20 knots, otherwise the Alaska Peninsula here, south to southwest at 30 knots, and Kodiak Island, southwesterlies at about 20 knots with 5-foot seas. Outlook for Thursday, west winds 25 knots there for Kodiak Island with seas 6 to 7 feet. Southwest winds 20 knots for Bristol Bay. It was seas at about 4 feet in the Alaska Peninsula. Southwest winds 20 to maybe 25 knots with seas as high as 10 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots with seas running 11 to 20 feet. Adak and Atka, southwest winds 30 knots, 10 to 20 foot seas there. For the western Aleutians, south to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And then for Thursday, western Aleutians, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And Adak and Atka looking at southwest winds at 25 and also southwesterlies at 25 knots for an Alaska Island or all of the eastern Aleutians with seas running 10 to 14 feet. Southwest coast for tomorrow, south of Nunivak Island, southwesterlies at 20 knots. And the Yukon Delta coast, south winds at 30 knots with southwest winds at 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound. St. Matthew Island, south winds 45 knots with 30-foot seas. Pribilofs, south of 20 with 20-foot seas. And then for Thursday, small craft advisories, St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George Islands. Southwest winds 25 knots, 11 to 16 foot seas. Kuskokwim Delta Coast, southwesterlies at 20 knots, and southwest winds at 25 knots for the Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island area, east of 15 for Norton Sound. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, east to southeast winds 25 to 35 knots, east of 15 for the western and central coast, east winds 20 knots for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast. And for Thursday, southeast winds here on the eastern Boulevard Sea coastline at 10 to 15 knots. East winds at 20 knots for the central coast, western coast, northeast at 20 knots. And the Chukchi Sea, lighter winds now from the east to south at about 15 knots.